I'm Robert Bobby Withers, 72. A quiet widower who spent decades working double shifts at the steel mill to raise my 3 kids alone. Last Sunday at our family dinner, my son laughed and said, "Dad, let's be honest, you never really accomplished anything with your life." My daughter nodded, adding, "I was just ordinary compared to their successful careers." Their words cut deeper than any wound I'd carried for 50 years. But tomorrow, when they see my name engraved on the new Vietnam War memorial downtown, they'll finally understand the truth I've kept buried since 1971, and why some accomplishments are measured not in money or titles, but in the lives you've saved and the brothers you've lost. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. If you've ever felt invisible to those who matter most, like this video, because this story is for you. The drive home from Michael's house felt longer than usual. My hands gripped the steering wheel of my old pickup truck, the same one I'd driven for 15 years because it still ran fine. Even if the paint had faded and the radio crackled, I kept hearing Michael's laugh. That dismissive chuckle that said everything about how he saw me now in my kitchen. I sat at the small table where Sarah and I had shared thousands of meals. The family photo from last Christmas stared back at me from the counter, all of us gathered around Michael's pristine dining room table. In the picture, I'm smiling, but my kids look distracted, checking their phones even during the photographer's countdown. The distance between us shows, even in that frozen moment. I pulled out my final time clock card from the steel mill. 45 years of punching in and out, of double shifts and overtime, of coming home exhausted but proud. The card was worn, smooth from handling, a testament to honest work that apparently meant nothing to my children. Michael, my eldest at 45, made partner at his law firm 3 years ago. Jennifer, 42, runs the cardiology department at the regional hospital. David, my youngest at 38, teaches high school English and coaches basketball. All of them successful, educated, respected in their communities. All of them embarrassed by their old man who worked with his hands. It wasn't always this way. When Sarah was alive, when they were young, I was their hero. I taught them to ride bikes, helped with homework, attended every game and recital. But somewhere along the way, as they climbed higher up the social ladder, I became a reminder of where they came from, a place they'd rather forget. After Sarah died 8 years ago, the gap widened. They visited out of obligation, not love. They spoke to me like I was simple, explaining things I already understood, talking around me at gatherings as if I wasn't there. Never accomplished anything. The words echoed in my empty house. Maybe they were right. Maybe 45 years of honest work, raising 3 kids alone after their mother died, keeping a roof over their heads and food on the table, maybe none of that counted as accomplishment in their world of degrees and titles and corner offices. That night, sleep wouldn't come. I wandered through my small house, past the photos of my children's graduations, their weddings, their achievements, all the moments where I stood proudly in the background. The blue-collar father they tolerated, but never celebrated, in my bedroom closet, buried beneath winter coats I rarely wore, sat a shoebox I hadn't opened in years. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid, revealing memories I'd kept sealed away like toxic waste. The yellowed draft notice lay on top, dated March 15th, 1970. Greetings. It began as if inviting me to a party instead of a war. I was 19 then, working construction and dating Sarah, planning a future that seemed so simple. The notice changed everything. Within 3 months, I was in basic training. By Christmas, I was in Vietnam, carrying an M16 and responsibilities I never imagined. The photograph underneath the draft notice showed 5 young men in jungle fatigues, arms draped over each other's shoulders, grinning despite the hell around us. Tommy Chen stood next to me, barely 18 but wise beyond his years. He'd grown up in San Francisco's Chinatown, spoke 3 languages, and could have gone to college if his family had the money. Instead, he ended up in the mud with the rest of us. Jimmy Mouse Rodriguez from El Paso, small but fearless, always making us laugh even when the mortar fell. Big Mike O'Sullivan from Boston, who got letters from 7 different girls and shared his care packages with anyone who needed them. And Danny Morrison from somewhere in Kansas, who talked constantly about his father's wheat farm and how he'd expand it. When he got home, we called ourselves the Dirty Five. We watched each other's backs, shared our fears in whispered conversations during guard duty, and promised we'd all make it home together. We were brothers in a way my own children would never understand, bound not by blood, but by shared terror and mutual dependence. I'd made a decision early in their lives never to talk about Vietnam. The country didn't want to hear about it, and I didn't want to burden them with my nightmares. Better to let them think their father was just an ordinary man who worked at the mill, paid his taxes, and never did anything remarkable. But as I sat there holding that photograph, Tommy's face smiling back at me, I wondered if my silence had protected them or just made me invisible. Tomorrow's memorial service would change everything, but tonight, I was just a lonely old man carrying secrets too heavy for one heart to bear. The memories came flooding back like a broken dam. I was 20 years old, 3 months into my tour, when I met Tommy Chen. He'd been assigned to our squad as a replacement after we lost Stevens to a sniper. Most new guys were scared, jumpy, dangerous to be around until they learned the rhythms of staying alive. But Tommy was different. He was quiet, observant, and had this way of appearing wherever he was needed most. During our first firefight together, when I was pinned down behind a fallen log with bullets chewing up the bark inches from my head, Tommy crawled 50 yards through the mud to get me ammunition. Never said a word about it afterward, like it was just what you did. My dog tags still hung around my neck hide, never taken them off, even after all these years. The metal was worn smooth, the letters barely visible, but I could still feel the weight of what they represented. In Vietnam, those tags weren't just identification, they were a promise that someone would bring you home. No matter what, Tommy and I became inseparable. He taught me basic Vietnamese phrases, helped me write letters to Sarah that didn't sound like they came from a scared kid. I shared my care packages with him, and we'd sit on watch together, talking about our futures. He wanted to be a teacher, maybe work with immigrant kids in San Francisco. I wanted to marry Sarah, buy a house with a big yard, raise a family. Mouse was our comic relief. Barely 5'6", but with a heart the size of Texas. He'd grown up tough in El Paso, the youngest of 8 kids, and nothing fazed him. When the monsoons came and we were living in mud up to our ankles, Mouse would start telling jokes or doing impressions of our commanding officers. He could make us laugh even when we were scared out of our minds. Big Mike was our gentle giant 6'4", strong as an ox, but wouldn't hurt a fly unless he had to. He'd been a star football player in high school, had scholarship offers to play college ball, but his number came up in the draft. He carried extra supplies for anyone who needed them and never complained about the weight. Danny was our dreamer, always talking about the wheat farm back in Kansas, how he'd expand it, maybe get into cattle too. He carried pictures of tractors in his wallet like other guys carried pictures of girlfriends. He'd described the smell of fresh cut wheat like it was perfume. And somehow he made us all homesick for places we'd never been. We weren't just soldiers, we were brothers. In the jungle, rank didn't matter, skin color didn't matter, where you came from didn't matter. All that mattered was that you'd die for the man next to you, and he'd die for you. That's a bond my children with their professional networks and social circles, could never understand. The respect we had for each other was absolute. When Tommy made a tactical suggestion, we listened. When Mouse spotted movement in the tree line, we took cover. When Big Mike said someone was hurt, we dropped everything to help. When Danny pointed out a safer path, we took it. We were a team. In the truest sense of the word, that brotherhood would be tested soon enough. But for those few months, living in hell, we found something pure and true that most people never experience in a lifetime of searching. The mission briefing came on. A steamy morning in July 1971. Lieutenant Morrison, no relation to our Danny, spread the tactical map across a makeshift table in our base camp. The map was already stained with coffee and marked with red ink, showing enemy positions. I can still see every detail of that map, the way the village of Phuoc Vinh was circled in blue, the dotted lines showing our planned route, the X's marking known dangers. Intelligence reports heavy enemy movement in this sector, the lieutenant said, his finger tracing the area around the village. Civilians are trapped. Command wants them evacuated before Charlie overruns the place. The village sat in a valley, surrounded by dense jungle, accessible by only two paths, both likely watched by enemy forces. It was a tactical nightmare, the kind of mission that separated the men from the boys. As the squad's unofficial leader, though, I was only 20, and outranked by Sergeant Philip Sy, studied that map like my life depended on it, because it did. How many civilians? I asked. Reports vary. Could be 30, could be 60. Families, mostly. Women, children, elderly. Tommy leaned over the map, his dark eyes calculating angles and distances. The northern approach offers better cover, he said quietly. But if we're compromised, there's no fallback position. Mouse pointed to the southern route. This way's more exposed, but we could establish a defensive perimeter here. He tapped a ridge that overlooked the village. Big Mike just shook his head. Either way, we're walking into a hornet's nest. Danny studied the terrain features, comparing them to the endless fields back home in Kansas. Ground's probably soft here from the rains, he observed. Vehicles won't make it. We'll be walking out with whatever civilians we can carry. The weight of command settled on my shoulders like a lead blanket. These men were looking to me for leadership, for decisions that could bring them home alive or get them killed. I'd never asked for the responsibility, but in combat, leadership isn't about rank, it's about who others trust to make the right call when everything goes to hell. We take the northern route, I decided. Tommy's right about the cover. We move fast, get the civilians organized, and extract using the southern path. If we're lucky, Charlie won't expect us to change routes. Sergeant Phillips nodded his approval. Withers, you'll coordinate the evacuation. Chen, you're on point. Rodriguez, you watch our 6. O'Sullivan, you help with the civilians. Morrison, you're our radio man. As we prepared our gear, checking weapons and ammunition, counting medical supplies, I felt the familiar mixture of fear and determination that came before every dangerous mission. But this one felt different. This wasn't about territory or tactical advantage. This was about saving innocent lives. People who'd been caught in the crossfire of a war they never asked for. Tommy approached me as I cleaned my rifle. You sure about this, Bobby? I looked at my friend, this kid from Chinatown who'd become my brother in arms. No, I admitted, but those people are counting on us. We can't let them down. He nodded, understanding passing between us without words. That's what made us brothers, not shared blood, but shared commitment to something bigger than ourselves. None of us knew that by the next evening. Half our squad would be dead, and I'd be carrying wounds that would never fully heal. All we knew was that innocent people needed help, and we were the only ones who could provide it. The ambush came at 1400 hours, just as we were loading the last of the civilians into our makeshift evacuation convoy. We'd successfully reached the village, organized the families, and were preparing to move out when the jungle erupted in gunfire. Tommy was the first to spot the muzzle flashes. "Contact, North Ridge," he shouted, diving for cover behind a burned-out HUT. I grabbed the radio from Danny's packet, taken a bullet in the shoulder in the first volley. "Base, this is Alpha Squad. We're taking heavy fire. Request immediate support." The static-filled response chilled my blood. "Alpha Squad, no support available. You're on your own." Mouse was laying down, covering fire with his M60, trying to keep the enemy pinned while Big Mike herded terrified civilians toward the southern exit. An elderly Vietnamese woman clutched her granddaughter, both of them frozen with terror in the middle of the kill zone. Without thinking, I sprinted across 30 yards of open ground under heavy fire. Bullets kicked up dirt around my feet. Wind passed my ears, but somehow I reached them. I scooped up the little girl and helped the grandmother to her feet, half carrying, half dragging them to safety behind a stone wall. "Bobby," Tommy's voice cut through the chaos. RPG, the rocket-propelled grenade, exploded 20 feet away, showering us with debris. The blast knocked me flat, and I felt something warm running down my left arm. But there was no time to check. The wound more civilians were trapped in the crossfire. Big Mike was down, blood spreading across his chest. Mouse was still firing, but his ammunition was running low. Danny was trying to work the radio with his good arm, calling for medevac that might never come. That's when I made the decision that would haunt and define me for the next 50 years. Instead of falling back, instead of saving what we could, and abandoning the rest, I chose to stay and fight. "Tommy," I shouted over the gunfire, "take the civilians south. I'll hold them here." "I'm not leaving you," he yelled back. "That's an order." I wasn't his superior, but in that moment, rank didn't matter. Someone had to make the hard choice. Tommy looked at me for a long moment, understanding passing between us. Then he nodded, gathered the civilians, and began moving them toward the southern exit. Mouse provided covering fire, dragging Big Mike with him. I was alone with my rifle, facing an enemy force that outnumbered me at least 10-1. But I had something they didn't: absolute certainty that what I was doing was right. Those families deserved to live, to see their children grow up, to go home to their rice paddies and their simple lives. The Purple Heart medal hidden in my shoebox came from what happened next. I held that position for 47 minutes, moving from cover to cover, making every shot count, giving Tommy and the others time to get the civilians to safety. I took shrapnel in my leg. Another bullet grazed my ribs, but I kept fighting. When the enemy finally overran my position, I was unconscious from blood loss. Tommy had come back for my gnawing orders, risking his own life and the lives of the civilians he'd already saved. He carried me half a mile through the jungle to the evacuation point, where a medevac helicopter was finally able to extract us. But Tommy never made it home. A sniper's bullet found him just as we reached the landing zone. He died in my arms, whispering about the kids he'd wanted to teach, the better world he'd hoped to help build. His blood mixed with mine on that blood-stained map I still kept, the one that marked the place where a 20-year-old kid from Chinatown became the bravest man I ever knew. The medal they tried to give me, the one I never accepted, represented the worst and best day of my life. I'd saved 37 civilians and most of my squad, but I'd lost my best friend in the process. Some accomplishments come with a price too high to celebrate. The discharge papers felt heavier than they should have when the clerk handed them to me at Travis Air Force Base in California. Honorable discharge, they read. Service completed. With distinction. But nothing about that piece of paper felt honorable or distinguished as I walked through the San Francisco airport in my dress uniform, trying to ignore the stares and whispered comments. "Baby killer," someone muttered as I passed. A woman in a flower print dress spat at my feet. These weren't isolated incidents. This was America's welcome home for Vietnam veterans in 1972. We were reminders of an unpopular war, scapegoats for decisions made by politicians we'd never met. I took off my uniform in an airport bathroom and stuffed it in a duffel bag. I'd never wear it again. Sarah was waiting for me at the gates. Her dark hair longer than when I'd left, worry lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before. She ran to me, and for a moment, holding her in my arms. The last 2 years felt like a nightmare. I was finally waking up from "You're home," she whispered against my chest. "You're really home?" But I wasn't. Not really. Part of me was still in that jungle, still hearing Tommy's last words, still seeing Big Mike's blood spreading across his chest. Part of me would always be 20 years old, making life and death decisions in a place most Americans couldn't find on a map. We drove to her apartment in silence. I wanted to tell her about Tommy, about the mission, about the medal they'd tried to give me. But how do you explain that you left part of your soul in a place your country wanted to forget? How do you describe the weight of saving lives when it cost you your best friend? "There are jobs at the steel mill," Sarah said as we sat on her couch, my head in her lap, her fingers running through my hair. "My father knows the foreman. It's honest work, good pay, honest work." That phrase would define the next 40 years of my life. I took the job because I needed something solid, something real, something that didn't require me to make decisions that could get people killed. I clocked in, did my job, clocked out. Simple. We were married 6 months later in a small ceremony at St. Mary's Catholic Church. Sarah wore her mother's dress, and I wore the only suit I owned. No military honors, no mention of my service. We were just two young people starting over, building something new from the pieces of what the war had left behind. The steel mill became my refuge. The work was hard, physical, requiring concentration that left no room for memories. The heat of the furnaces, the smell of molten metal, the rhythm of production, it all conspired to keep my mind in the present, away from the ghosts that haunted my sleep. My co-workers never asked about the war, and I never volunteered information. I became Bobby the steel worker, Bobby the reliable guy who never missed a shift, Bobby who kept his head down and did his job. It was a simpler identity than Bobby the soldier, Bobby the hero, Bobby the man who'd lost his best friend saving strangers. This was the beginning of my ordinary life, the life my children would later dismiss as unremarkable. Sarah's wedding ring caught the light as she placed her hand over mine at the breakfast table. Even now, 8 years after her death, I still wore Mina's simple gold band that had become part of my skin, a reminder of the love that had anchored me to the world after Vietnam. Our wedding day in 1973 was the first time I'd felt truly hopeful since coming home. Sarah radiated joy in her mother's ivory dress, and as we exchanged vows, I made a silent promise to be the husband and father I'd never had growing up. My own dad had been distant, cold, more interested in his bottle than his family. I would be different. Michael was born in 1974, a squalling, red-faced bundle of possibilities. I held him in the hospital, this tiny life that depended on me completely, and felt a terror greater than anything I'd experienced in combat. In war, you only had to keep yourself and your squad alive. Now I was responsible for this perfect little person who looked at me like I was the center of his universe. Jennifer arrived 2 years later, followed by David in 1981. Our little house on Maple Street overflowed with laughter, toys, and the controlled chaos that comes with raising 3 kids on a steel worker's salary. Sarah managed the household budget like a general commanding troops, stretching every dollar to cover groceries, clothing, and the small luxuries that made childhood special. I worked double shifts whenever they were available, not because I loved the mill, but because I loved my family more. Every extra hour meant money for Michael's Little League equipment, Jennifer's piano lessons, David's art supplies. I'd come home exhausted, covered in grime and sweat, but Sarah would have dinner waiting, and the kids would rush to greet me, like I was returning from a grand adventure instead of 8 hours of back-breaking labor. Evenings were ours. I helped with homework at the kitchen table, teaching Michael fractions using pieces of Sarah's pie, reading bedtime stories to Jennifer in different voices until she giggled herself to sleep, showing David how to sketch the birds that visited our backyard feeder. These were the moments that mattered, not the medals or commendations gathering dust in a shoebox, but the simple act of being present for the people who needed me most. I coached Michael's baseball team for 3 years, teaching young boys not just how to swing a bat, but how to support their teammates, how to handle both victory and defeat with grace. I built Jennifer a dollhouse from scratch, working in the garage after she'd gone to bed, trying to create something beautiful enough to match her imagination. Sarah and I would sit on the front porch after the kids were asleep, sharing a beer and talking about their futures. We dreamed big for them: college educations, professional careers, opportunities we'd never had. We wanted them to climb higher than we ever could, to have choices we'd never been given. "They'll do great things," Sarah would say, her head on my shoulder as we watched fireflies dance in the growing darkness. "They already are," I'd reply, thinking of Michael's determination, Jennifer's kindness, David's creativity. Those were golden years, when being ordinary felt extraordinary, when coming home to a house full of love was the greatest accomplishment. I could imagine I was a good father then, present and engaged, the kind of man who showed up to every school play and parent conference, who taught his children that hard work and integrity mattered more than money or status. If only I could have known that success would eventually become a wedge between us, that their rise would coincide with my fall in their estimation. The stack of medical bills on my kitchen counter told the story of Sarah's final 2 years better than any words could. Each invoice, each insurance denial, each copayment receipt represented another step in our family's slow unraveling. The total came to just over $127,000 more money than I'd made in 3 years at the mill. Sarah's cancer was diagnosed in the spring of 2006, when she was only 50. A routine mammogram revealed a mass that the doctors initially called probably benign. But cancer doesn't care about probability, and by the time they realized their mistake, it had spread to her lymph nodes. "We'll fight this," I told her after. The oncologist explained the treatment plan: chemotherapy, radiation, possibly surgery. The doctor quoted survival statistics like he was reading baseball scores, clinical and detached. "We'll need the best care available," Sarah said quietly. "The kids deserve to have their mother around for their weddings, their children." I mortgaged our house to pay for treatments insurance wouldn't cover. I took every overtime shift the mill offered, working 16-hour days until my hands bled and my back screamed. When that wasn't enough, I took a second job cleaning office buildings at night, mopping floors and emptying trash cans while Sarah underwent chemotherapy that made her violently sick. Michael was in law school then, Jennifer finishing her medical residency, David starting his teaching career. They were all struggling financially themselves, building their professional lives, and I didn't want to burden them with our problems. This was my responsibility. Taking care of Sarah was what her husband did. But as the bills mounted and Sarah grew weaker, I began to see something shift in my children's eyes when they visited. Embarrassment, not about their mother's illness, but about their father's inability to handle it with the kind of quiet competence they'd expected. They'd begun to see me not as the man who'd raised them, but as someone whose limitations were becoming painfully obvious. "Dad, you should have told us how bad the finances were," Michael said one evening, after reviewing our situation with his lawyer's eye for detail. "There are programs available, legal options. We could have helped," Jennifer added, though I could hear the strain in her voice. She was already carrying medical school debt that would take decades to pay off. David just looked uncomfortable, torn between wanting to help and needing to focus on his own family. He'd married young and had 2 small children. What they didn't understand was that asking for help meant admitting failure. I'd always been the provider, the problem solver, the man who handled whatever life threw at our family. Suddenly, I was the problem that needed solving, and my children, my successful, educated children, could see every crack in the facade I'd built around our ordinary life. Sarah fought for 18 months with a courage that put my battlefield heroics to shame. She endured treatments that ravaged her body, maintained her dignity when the disease stole her hair and her strength, and never once complained about the financial stress her illness was causing. She died on a Tuesday morning in November 2007, holding my hand in the hospital bed that had become her world. Her last words were about the kids. "Take care of them, Bobby. Help them remember that love matters more than anything else." But in the years that followed, as I struggled to rebuild our finances and cope with loneliness that felt like a physical weight, my children's visits became less frequent, their conversations more stilted. They'd achieved the success Sarah and I had dreamed of for them, but somehow my role in their lives had diminished to that of an obligation, a reminder of modest beginnings they preferred to forget. The medical bills were finally paid off 5 years later, but the damage to our family relationships proved far more expensive to repair. The college tuition receipts were yellowed now, tucked in a manila folder I kept in my desk drawer. 47 separate payments over 12 years each, one representing another double shift, another night job, another sacrifice I'd made gladly. The total came to $184,000, money I'd somehow found despite never earning more than $28 an hour at the mill. Michael's law school at Georgetown, $52,000. Jennifer's medical school at Johns Hopkins, $78,000. David's education, degree and master's program, $34,000, plus room and board, books, living expenses, all of it paid without a single student loan, because I'd been determined my children would start their adult lives free from debt. I'd driven a 15-year-old pickup truck while my kids drove decent used cars. I'd bought them for graduation. I'd eaten bologna sandwiches for lunch while making sure they had money for proper meals. I'd worn the same 3 work shirts until they were threadbare while buying them professional wardrobes for internships and job interviews. None of them knew about the second mortgage I'd taken on the house to pay for Jennifer's final year of medical school. None of them knew about the 3rd job I'd worked restocking shelves at a grocery store from midnight to 6 a.m. to cover David's graduate program expenses. I'd been careful to hide the extent of my sacrifices, not wanting them to feel guilty about pursuing their dreams. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd worked myself to exhaustion to give them opportunities I'd never had, and their success had become the measure by which they judged my failure. Standing in their professional circles, Michael's law partners, Jennifer's medical colleagues, David's fellow teachers with their advanced degrees, was the blue-collar father who didn't quite fit, who used the wrong fork at dinner parties, and couldn't contribute to conversations about wine or theater or European vacations. Michael's friends were other lawyers, investment bankers, executives whose fathers owned businesses or held important positions. When Michael introduced me, it was always with a slight apology in his voice. "This is my dad. He worked at the steel mill." As if my 45 years of honest labor was something to be excused rather than respected. Jennifer's colleagues assumed I must be proud of my daughter's achievements. I was, enormously, but they spoke to me like I was simple, using small words and speaking slowly, as if my lack of formal education meant I couldn't understand complex ideas. They didn't know I'd taught myself advanced mathematics to help Jennifer with calculus, or that I'd read every book she'd been assigned in pre-med to better understand her studies. David, my youngest, struggled most with the class divide. As a teacher, he worked with other educated professionals, but his salary was modest, closer to what I'd made at the mill. He felt caught between worlds, too successful to relate to my experience, not successful enough to fully join his siblings' circles. Sometimes I caught him looking at me with a mixture of love and embarrassment that broke my heart. The breaking point came at Michael's wedding in 2005. The country club reception was elegant, expensive, populated by people who'd never worked with their hands or worried about making rent. During the father-son dance, Michael whispered, "Thanks for everything, Dad. I know this isn't really your kind of place." He meant it kindly, but those words cut deeper than any enemy bullet. I'd given him everything, not just money for education, but love, guidance, values, and he saw me as someone who didn't belong in the life I'd helped him build. I was the stepping stone he'd use to reach higher ground. Now awkward and out of place in his success, Sarah would have known how to bridge that gap, how to help our children understand that their father's worth couldn't be measured in degrees or salary figures. But Sarah was gone, and I was just an aging steelworker who'd outlived his usefulness, whose sacrifices had become invisible to the very people who'd benefited from them most. Standing in my empty house, surrounded by proof of my children's achievements and my own contributions to them, I felt more alone than I had in the jungles of Vietnam. At least there, my brothers had valued what I brought to the fight. The newspaper clipping was small, buried on page 4 of the local section between an article about the school board budget and an advertisement for lawn care services. City. To dedicate Vietnam War Memorial this Saturday. The headline read. I almost missed it, but something made me look closer, and there it was, the announcement that would change everything. The memorial will honor local veterans who served with distinction in the Vietnam conflict. The article continued. Names of Medal of Honor recipients, Purple Heart recipients, and other decorated veterans will be engraved on bronze plaques surrounding the central monument. My coffee grew cold as I read those words again and again. Medal of Honor recipients, Purple Heart recipients, other decorated veterans. My hands trembled as I set the paper down, memories flooding back like a broken dam. The Purple Heart medal was still in that shoebox, wrapped in tissue paper, never displayed, never acknowledged. I'd turned down the formal ceremony 47 years ago, unable to accept recognition for actions that had cost Tommy his life. The army had processed the paperwork anyway, mailing the medal to my parents' address with a form letter about meritorious service in the face of enemy action. But somehow, despite my refusal to attend the ceremony, despite my decades of silence about my service, my name had found its way onto the memorial list. Someone, some clerk in some office, had dug through old records and discovered that Robert Withers of Maple Street had earned the right to be remembered. I called the number listed in the article, reaching a cheerful woman at the Veterans Affairs office. "Oh, Mr. Withers," she said when I identified myself, "we've been trying to reach you for months. Your military records show significant decorations, Purple Heart, a Bronze Star, and you were recommended for a Silver Star, though that paperwork seems to have been lost in processing. You're one of our most decorated local veterans. Bronze Star, Silver Star recommendation." I'd never known about any awards beyond the Purple Heart. The military bureaucracy of 1971 had been chaos, and I'd left Vietnam in a medevac helicopter, never going through proper out-processing channels. "The ceremony is this Saturday at 2 p.m., she continued. "We'd be honored to have you attend. There will be a small reception afterward, and we're hoping some of our veterans will share their experiences with the community." Share their experiences. For 50 years, I'd kept those experiences locked away, convinced that no one wanted to hear about Vietnam, that my children were better off not knowing about their father's violent past. But maybe, just maybe, it was time for the truth. I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen, staring at that newspaper clipping. In 3 days, my name would be read aloud at a public ceremony. My service would be acknowledged by the community I'd lived in for decades. The recognition I'd avoided for half a century was finally coming. Whether I was ready or not, part of me wanted to skip the ceremony, to let them read my name to an empty chair, and continue living the quiet, unremarkable life my children expected from me. But another part, the part that had carried Tommy Chun's memory for 50 years, the part that had never stopped being a soldier, knew it was time to step forward. My children needed to know who their father really was. Not the ordinary steel worker who'd embarrassed them at dinner parties, but the young man who'd risked everything to save innocent lives, who'd earned the respect of his brothers in arms, who'd carried the weight of heroism and loss in silence for longer than they'd been alive. Saturday would be the day I stopped being invisible, the day I reclaimed the part of myself I'd buried in a shoebox under winter coats. For better or worse, my family was about to discover that their ordinary father had been hiding an extraordinary truth. I spent Thursday evening tracking down phone numbers I hadn't used in decades. The first call was to Mouse Jimmy Rodriguez, who'd settled in Phoenix after the war. His wife answered, her voice cautious until I explained who I was. Bobby Withers. Holy hell, Bobby. Jimmy's been wondering about you for years. Hold on, let me get him. Mouse's voice was older, rougher, but still carried that unmistakable El Paso accent. Bobby, you son of a gun. I can't believe it's really you. How long has it been? Too long, Mouse. Too damn long. We talked for an hour, sharing updates about our families, our jobs, our lives. Mouse had become a successful contractor, married, his high school sweetheart, raised for kids. But when the conversation turned to Vietnam, to Tommy and Big Mike and Danny, his voice grew quiet. I still think about that day, he said. What you did, man, holding that position so we could get those people out. Tommy talked about it right up until his voice broke. You saved my life, Bobby. Saved all our lives. The second call was to Danny Morrison, the Kansas farm boy who'd made it home to expand his father's wheat operation just like he'd dreamed. His voice was weathered by years of wind and sun, but warm with genuine affection. Bobby Withers. I'll be damned. You know, I drive past the VA hospital in Wichita sometimes, and I always wonder about the guys from our squad. How the hell are you? Danny had built the life he'd talked about in foxholes, thousands of acres of wheat and corn, 3 sons who worked the land with him, grandchildren who'd carry on the family tradition. But he'd never forgotten the jungle, never stopped wondering about the brothers he'd left behind. I got a package in the mail last week, Danny said. A official-looking thing from the army. Turns out they finally processed some paperwork from our tour. Said I was being awarded a Bronze Star for actions during that evacuation mission. 47 years late, but they're having a ceremony next month. Bronze Star, the same decoration the Veterans Affairs woman had mentioned. Apparently, the army had finally gotten around to recognizing what we'd done that day in Folk Vin. The third call was the hardest too. Big Mike's younger brother, Patrick, in Boston. Mike had survived his chest wound, but died in a car accident in 1985, leaving behind a wife and 2 daughters. Patrick had kept in touch with Mike's old squad mates over the years, serving as a link to the brother who'd carried his teammates' gear and shared his care packages with anyone who needed them. Mike talked about you all the time, Patrick said. About the day you saved those civilians. About Tommy's sacrifice. He said you were the best leader he ever served under. Better than most of the officers. He'd be proud to know you're finally getting recognition. The letters arrived by overnight mail on Friday, photocopies of official documents Patrick had preserved in Mike's memory. Commendations, award citations, after-action reports that painted a picture of heroism I'd never fully understood. According to the paperwork, I'd been recommended not just for the Silver Star, but for the Congressional Medal of Honor. The recommendation had been downgraded somewhere in the bureaucratic chain, lost in the chaos of a war the country wanted to forget. But there it was, in black and white. Private First Class Robert Withers displayed extraordinary heroism under fire, single-handedly holding a defensive position against overwhelming enemy forces while coordinating the evacuation of 37 Vietnamese civilians. His actions saved numerous lives and exemplify the highest traditions of military service. I sat in my kitchen reading those words over and over, trying to reconcile the hero described in the documents with the ordinary man my children saw. For 50 years, I'd carried the guilt of Tommy's death, the weight of decisions made in desperate moments. I'd never considered that those same actions might be worthy of respect, of honor, of memory. Saturday's ceremony was less than 20 hours away. In my closet hung the one suit I owned, pressed and ready. In my shoebox lay the Purple Heart Medal, wrapped in tissue paper, waiting to see daylight for the first time in decades. My children had no idea what was coming. They'd dismissed their father as unremarkable, ordinary, a man who'd accomplished nothing with his life. Tomorrow, they would learn the truth about the young soldier who'd risked everything to save strangers, who'd earned the respect of his brothers in arms, who'd carried the weight of heroism in silence for longer than they'd been alive. For the first time in years, I felt like the man I'd been at 20, scared but determined, uncertain but committed to doing what was right. Tomorrow, I would step out of the shadows and reclaim the part of myself I'd hidden away. Tomorrow, my family would meet the real Bobby Withers. Saturday morning dawned clear and crisp, the kind of autumn day that made the bronze memorial plaques gleam like mirrors in the sunlight. I arrived at Veterans Memorial Park 30 minutes early, wearing my only suit and carrying the Purple Heart Medal in my jacket pocket. The first time it had left the shoebox in 47 years. The memorial was more impressive than I'd expected. A black granite wall curved in a gentle arc, surrounded by bronze plaques mounted on concrete pedestals. American flags lined the walkway, snapping in the October breeze. Folding chairs had been arranged in neat rows, facing a small podium, and volunteers were setting up a sound system. I found my name on the third plaque from the left. Robert Bobby Withers, PFC U.S. Army, Purple Heart, Bronze Star. Seeing it there, permanent and official, made my service real in a way it hadn't been since I'd come home. For 50 years, my war had existed only in nightmares and memories. Now, it was literally set in stone. Other veterans began arriving, most of them my age or older, many wearing pieces of their old uniforms or military caps adorned with unit patches. I recognized the look in their eyes, the mixture of pride and pain that came with remembering service most people preferred to forget. We nodded to each other with the understanding that passes between men who'd seen the same darkness and somehow found their way back to the light. Bobby Withers, a tall man with silver hair, approached, his hand extended. "I'm Colonel Morrison, retired. I was Lieutenant Morrison back in 71. I gave you the briefing for the Phuoc Vinh mission." The years fell away as I shook his hand. This was the young officer who'd spread that blood-stained map on the makeshift table, who'd trusted a 20-year-old PFC to coordinate a civilian evacuation under fire. "I've been following your story through military channels," he continued. "The paperwork for your Medal of Honor recommendation finally surfaced last year. It's a damn shame it took this long for your service to be recognized properly. Medal of Honor recommendation." The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd saved lives, yes, but I'd also lost my best friend. Heroes weren't supposed to feel guilty about their heroism. The ceremony began at exactly 2 p.m. Mayor Patterson spoke about sacrifice and service, about the debt we owed to those who'd answered their country's call. A Navy chaplain offered a prayer for the living and the dead. Then Colonel Morrison took the podium to read the names of Purple Heart recipients. Private First Class Robert Bobby Withers, he announced, his voice carrying across the park. Wounded in action while single-handedly defending a civilian evacuation site, saving 37 Vietnamese non-combatants and the lives of his squad members. A scattered applause rippled through the crowd, but I barely heard it. I was staring at 3 familiar faces in the back row: Michael, Jennifer, and David, their expressions shifting from confusion to shock to something approaching awe. They'd come, somehow, despite never showing interest in local events, despite their dismissal of everything connected to my ordinary life. My children had come to the memorial service, and they'd heard their father described as a hero. After the ceremony, as the crowd mingled around displays of military memorabilia and shared stories over coffee and cookies, my children approached slowly, uncertain. Michael spoke first, his lawyer's composure cracking. "Dad, we had no idea. Why didn't you ever tell us?" Jennifer's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "The Purple Heart, the Bronze Star, you saved all those people." David, my youngest, looked stricken. "We said such horrible things about you never accomplishing anything. God, Dad, how can you ever forgive us?" Standing there in the autumn sunlight, surrounded by flags and fellow veterans, with my children finally seeing me for who I really was, I felt 50 years of silence lifting from my shoulders like fog burning off in the morning sun. The bronze plaque behind me bore witness to a truth I'd kept hidden too long, that ordinary men sometimes do extraordinary things, and that the measure of a life can't be taken by salary or status or social position. "There's more to tell," I said quietly, "about your Uncle Tommy. He wasn't really your uncle, but he should have been. About the brothers I served with, the family I found in hell, the reasons I never talked about any of it." For the first time in years, my children looked at me not with embarrassment or condescension, but with respect, curiosity, and something that might have been pride. The memorial service had given me back more than recognition. It had given me back my family. The real conversation would happen later, in private, with time to explain the weight of memories I'd carried alone. But for now, it was enough that they knew their father had been more than they'd imagined, that his life had mattered in ways they were only beginning to understand. The official citation arrived by certified mail on Monday morning, as if the universe had decided it was time for all my secrets to surface at once. The envelope bore the seal of the Department of Defense, and inside was a document that made my hands shake as I read it. "The President of the United States takes pleasure in presenting the Silver Star Medal to Private First Class Robert Withers, United States Army, for gallantry in action against an armed enemy of the United States while serving with the 25th Infantry Division in the Republic of Vietnam on the 23rd of July, 1971. The citation went on to describe the action in clinical military language, but the words painted a picture of heroism I'd never seen in myself. Private First Class Withers. Extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty were in keeping with the highest traditions of military service and reflect great credit upon himself, his unit, and the United States Army. 50 years late, but the Army had finally gotten its paperwork right. I called Michael first, my hands still trembling as I dialed his office number. His secretary put me through immediately. Apparently, word had spread about Saturday's revelations. "Dad, is everything okay? I need to see you and your brother and sister, all of you, tonight, if possible. There's more to tell, and I think it's time you heard all of it." They gathered at my house that evening, the first time all 3 had been in my kitchen since their mother's funeral. I'd laid out the contents of the shoebox on the table like evidence in a trial. The Purple Heart Medal, the Bronze Star, the Silver Star citation, the blood-stained tactical map, the photograph of the Dirty Five, and the letters from my surviving squad mates. But the most important artifact was one I'd never shown anyone: a letter Tommy Chen had written to his family before our final mission. Never sent, found among his possessions after his death and forwarded to me by a chaplain who thought I should have it. My dear family, Tommy had written in his careful handwriting, if you are reading this, then I did not make it home from this war. Please know that I died with honor, serving alongside the finest men I have ever known. Bobby Withers has become the brother I never had, and if I fall, I know he will carry our story forward. He is the best of us, brave, selfless, and true. Trust in his judgment, for he has never led us wrong. I read Tommy's words aloud, my voice breaking as I reached the final paragraph. Tell my parents that their son died trying to save innocent lives, that he was part of something bigger than himself, that the boy they raised with love and discipline became a man they can be proud of. And tell Bobby that losing him would be the only failure I could not bear. He must survive this war, must go home to his Sarah, must build the life we have all dreamed of in this green hell. He carries the best of all of us now. The silence in my kitchen was profound when I finished reading. Jennifer was crying openly, and Michael sat staring at the tactical map with its rust-colored stains, Tommy's blood mixed with mine, marking the place where innocence ended and manhood began in the space of 47 minutes. Why? David asked finally. Why did you never tell us any of this? I looked at my youngest son, seeing Sarah's eyes in his face, remembering the young father I'd been when he was born. Because I wanted you to see me as your dad, not as a soldier. I wanted to protect you from the weight of what I'd seen, what I'd done. I thought if I just focused on being present, on providing for you, on loving youth, that would be enough. But you were a hero, Jennifer said, touching the Purple Heart Medal with gentle fingers. You saved all those people. You earned these decorations. Heroes don't lose their best friends, I replied. Heroes don't come home when better men die. I carried Tommy out of that jungle, but I couldn't save him. Every day since then, I've wondered if someone else could have made different choices, better choices. Michael, ever the lawyer, leaned forward with the intensity that had made him successful in courtroom arguments. Dad, you were 20 years old. You made split-second decisions under fire that saved 37 innocent lives and most of your squad. Tommy chose to come back for youth. That was his decision, his honor. You can't carry guilt for his courage. Colonel Morrison had called that afternoon with more details about the mission. Details that had taken 50 years to fully declassify. The village of Fort Vin had been completely overrun 2 hours after our evacuation. Every civilian who remained behind had been killed. Our action, my decision to hold that position, had saved every person we'd managed to extract. There's something else, I said, pulling out the final document, a letter from the Vietnamese government, delivered through diplomatic channels to the Veterans Affairs Office. It was signed by 3 of the children we'd rescued that day, now grown adults with families of their own. We have never forgotten the young American soldiers who risked their lives to save our families. The letter read, Mr. Robert Withers, we have searched for you for many years to say thank you. Our children and grandchildren exist because of your courage. You are forever in our prayers. The room fell silent again as my children absorbed the magnitude of what I'd carried alone for 5 decades. These weren't just war stories, they were proof of a life lived with purpose, of decisions that echoed across generations, of a father who'd been shaped by experiences they were only beginning to understand. We owe you an apology, Michael said finally. What we said last Sunday? No, I interrupted. You owe me nothing. I chose to hide this part of my life. I chose to let you see only the mill worker, the widower, the ordinary man. Maybe it's time we all learned to see each other more clearly. The conversation continued past midnight. 50 years of silence giving way to questions, tears, and the kind of honest communication our family hadn't shared since Sarah's death. My children took turns holding Tommy's letter, reading his words about brotherhood and sacrifice, beginning to understand the weight their father had carried alone. "I remember you having nightmares," Jennifer said quietly. "When I was little, I'd hear you wake up sometimes, hear Mum talking to you. I thought it was about work, about stress. They were about Tommy," I admitted, "about the friends I'd lost, the decisions I'd made. Your mother was the only one who knew, and she helped me carry it." After she died, I paused, the grief still fresh even after 8 years. After she died, there was no one left who understood. David reached across the table and placed his hand over mine. "There is now. We want to understand, Dad. We want to know who you really are." Michael had been studying the official citations with his lawyer's attention to detail. "Dad, do you realize what this means? You weren't just a decorated veteran, you were recommended for the Medal of Honor, the highest recognition this country can give. That recommendation doesn't happen for ordinary actions." "But it didn't go through," I said. "The paperwork got lost because the war was unpopular and the military was in chaos," Jennifer interrupted. "Not because you didn't deserve it. From what I'm reading here, what you did was extraordinary by any measure." They wanted to hear everything about basic training, about meeting Tommy and the rest of the squad, about the day-to-day reality of being a soldier in an unpopular war. I found myself telling stories I'd never shared with anyone. Memories that had lived in darkness for decades finally brought into the light. I told them about Tommy's dream of teaching immigrant children, about how he'd helped me write letters to their mother that didn't sound like they came from a scared kid. I described Mouse's infectious humor, Big Mike's gentle strength, Danny's homesickness for Kansas wheat fields. These weren't just names on a casualty list, they were young men with dreams and fears and futures that had been cut short. "I understand now why you never talked about it," David said. "It's not just your story, belongs to them too." "That's exactly right," I replied. "I couldn't tell my story without telling theirs, and their stories ended in that jungle. It felt like betrayal to come home and live the life Tommy would never have." Jennifer, with her medical training, understood something the others missed. "Dad, what you're describing sounds like survivor's guilt. It's a recognized condition, something we see in trauma patients all the time. You've been carrying this burden alone when you should have been getting help." "Different time," I said. "Different understanding. Soldiers didn't talk about feelings in 1972. We just came home and got on with our lives." "But you didn't just get on with your life," Michael observed. "You built something meaningful. You raised 3 children, worked for 45 years, contributed to your community. Mom always said you were the most ethical man she'd ever known. That came from somewhere." The conversation turned to their own lives, their own struggles with measuring success and accomplishment. Michael admitted that his law practice, while financially successful, often left him feeling empty. "I defend corporate interests for money. You saved lives because it was right. Which one of us has really accomplished something meaningful?" Jennifer spoke about the pressures of modern medicine, the way insurance companies and hospital administrators had turned healing into a business. "I became a doctor to help people, but sometimes I feel like I'm just processing patients. You actually saved 37 lives in one day. I'm not sure I've had that kind of direct impact in my entire career." David, my teacher's son, understood better than the others. "I see kids every day who need someone to believe in them, to show them they matter. That's what you did for us, Dad. And that's what you did for those villagers in Vietnam. You showed up when it mattered most." As the night wore on, I pulled out one more item from the shoebox of photo album Sarah had kept, documenting our family life from the children's birth through their high school graduations. Page after page showed me present for every important moment, coaching Little League, attending piano recitals, helping with science fair projects, cheering at basketball games. Your mother saved all of this, I told them. She said these were the real accomplishments, not medals or recognition, but showing up for the people you love, day after day, year after year. Jennifer traced her finger over a photo of me teaching her to ride a bicycle, my hand steady on the seat as she wobbled down the sidewalk. I remember this day. I was so scared, but you promised you wouldn't let me fall. And I didn't, I said. None of you fell. That was the point. The clock chimed 1 a.m., but none of us wanted the conversation to end. We'd broken through 50 years of accumulated distance, found our way back to each other across a chasm that had seemed unbridgeable just days before. My children finally understood that their father's life had been shaped by experiences they could barely imagine, that his quiet strength had been forged in circumstances that demanded everything he had to give. We were wrong, Michael said, as they prepared to leave. About you never accomplishing anything. We were so wrong. You weren't wrong about what you saw, I replied, just incomplete about what you understood. Sometimes the most important accomplishments are the ones that happen in shadow, the ones that never make the newspapers or earn recognition. Sometimes the greatest victories are the ones only you and God know about. Standing on my front porch, watching my children drive away, I felt lighter than I had in years. The weight of secrets had lifted, replaced by something I'd almost forgotten, the possibility of being truly known and accepted by the people who mattered most. The following Sunday, they all came to dinner, not at Michael's pristine house this time, but at my kitchen table where we'd shared thousands of meals when they were young. Jennifer brought homemade bread, David contributed a salad from his garden, and Michael arrived with flowers for Sarah's grave, which we'd visit together after eating. The photo album Sarah had kept sat open between us as we ate, each page revealing moments of quiet heroism I'd never recognized in myself. There I was, age 35, staying up all night to help Michael with a school project about the solar system. Another photo showed me teaching Jennifer to change a tire when she was 16, determined that my daughter would never be helpless on the side of the road. A third captured me in the stands at David's high school basketball games, cheering, louder than any other parent. Mom documented everything, Jennifer said, turning pages carefully. Look at this, you, at every single one of my piano recitals, even when you were working double shifts. The photos told a story I'd forgotten, not of an ordinary man marking time, but of a father who'd shown up consistently, deliberately, lovingly for 25 years. Sarah had seen what I couldn't see myself, that raising children with intention and presence was its own form of heroism, requiring the same courage and commitment I'd shown in Vietnam. I talked to some colleagues this week, Michael said, cutting into his pot roast, about veterans' rights, legal issues facing older vets. There's a lot of work to be done, advocacy that's needed. I'm thinking about shifting my practice, maybe taking on more pro bono cases for veterans. David nodded enthusiastically. I've been researching curriculum about the Vietnam War, oral history projects. A lot of my students have never heard firsthand accounts from veterans. Would you consider speaking to my classes, Dad? Sharing some of these stories? Jennifer was more direct. I want to specialize in PTSD treatment. There are new therapies, new approaches to helping veterans process trauma. I should have recognized the signs in you years ago, should have understood what you were carrying. You were children, I said. It wasn't your job to fix your old man's problems. But we're adults now, Michael replied, and we understand responsibility, service, giving back. You taught us those values, Dad. Maybe it's time we used them. The conversation flowed more easily than it had in years. They asked questions about the mill, about my co-workers, about the life they'd dismissed as ordinary. I found myself describing the dignity of honest work, the satisfaction of building something with your hands, the camaraderie of men who depended on each other to stay safe in a dangerous environment. It sounds like the military, David observed. Different uniform, same brotherhood. Exactly, I said. Different mission, same values. Looking out for each other, doing your job right, taking pride in the work itself. As evening approached, we drove to the cemetery together for generations represented by Sarah's headstone and my eventual place beside her. My children's accomplishments, their children who would carry our family forward. Standing there, I told them about the promises I'd made to their mother, about my determination to honor her memory by being the father she'd believed I could be. She would be proud of today, Jennifer said, placing flowers on the grave. Proud of you for finally sharing your story. Proud of us for finally listening. The drive home was quiet but comfortable, the kind of peaceful silence that exists between people who understand each other. My children had seen behind the curtain of my ordinary life and discovered something worth respecting. More importantly, they'd begun to understand that their own successes were built on a foundation of love and sacrifice that had been invisible but never absent. That night, I started writing in a journal something I'd never done before, but felt necessary now. If my grandchildren were going to understand their family history, someone needed to preserve it. Someone needed to explain how their grandfather had learned that true accomplishment couldn't be measured in dollars or degrees, but in lives touched, duties fulfilled, and love given without expectation of recognition. The journal became my evening ritual, each entry a thread in the tapestry of our family's story. I wrote about Tommy and the Dirty Five, about Sarah's courage during her illness, about the pride I'd felt watching my children graduate and build their own lives. But mostly, I wrote about the small moments, the bedtime stories, the homework sessions, the quiet conversations that had shaped 3 young people into adults I was proud to call my children. Michael's law practice transformation happened faster than anyone expected. Within 2 months, he'd taken on 6 veterans' disability cases, working pro bono to help men and women navigate the bureaucratic maze of military benefits. His first success was helping a homeless Vietnam vet get the medical care he'd been denied for decades. Turns out, corporate law doesn't hold a candle to actually helping people, he told me over lunch. I should have made this change years ago. Jennifer enrolled in a specialized program for treating combat-related PTSD, studying the latest research on trauma, recovery, and therapeutic techniques. She'd volunteered to lead a support group at the VA hospital, drawing on her newfound understanding of what veterans carried home from war. I keep thinking about what you said, she told me during one of our weekly dinners, about Tommy's death, feeling like failure instead of heroism. That's the trauma talking, Dad. That's what we're learning to treat now. David's oral history project became a model for other schools in the district. He'd interviewed a dozen local veterans, preserving their stories for future generations. His students were engaged in ways he'd never seen, connecting with history through personal narratives that made textbook facts come alive. The kids love your story, especially, he said. They can't believe they're quiet. Mr. Morrison's dad was this incredible war hero. You've become something of a legend at school. War hero. The phrase still made me uncomfortable, but I was learning to accept that my children needed to see me that way, needed to understand that their father had been capable of extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it. It helped them make sense of their own lives, their own potential for making a difference. The ripple effects extended beyond my immediate family. My grandchildren, Michael's 2 teenage daughters, and David's younger son began asking questions about their grandfather's service, about family history they'd never known existed. I found myself telling them sanitized versions of war stories, focusing on themes of courage, friendship, and doing the right thing even when it was difficult. Grandpa Bobby, my 10-year-old grandson, asked during a sleepover, "Were you really friends with someone from China?" San Francisco's Chinatown, I corrected gently. His name was Tommy Chen, and he was the bravest man I ever knew. He taught me that it doesn't matter where you come from, what matters is how you treat the people around you. The journal grew thicker as winter turned to spring. I wrote about my own father's absence, about my determination to be different, about the lessons I'd learned from both war and peace. I wrote about Sarah's wisdom, about the way she'd helped me heal from wounds that were deeper than shrapnel, about her understanding that some battles are fought long after the shooting stops. Mouse called one evening with news that the army was finally processing our squad's long-delayed decorations. A formal ceremony was being planned at Fort Knox, with surviving members invited to receive their medals in front of family and fellow veterans. "Will you come?" he asked. "Danny's driving up from Kansas, and I'm flying in from Phoenix. We haven't been together since the funeral in '85. The funeral he mentioned was Big Mike's, the last time our surviving squad had gathered. The last time we'd shared stories and memories without the weight of 5 decades between us and our service. "I'll be there," I promised, "and I'm bringing my family. They need to meet the men who knew their father when he was young and stupid and brave." The ceremony was scheduled for Memorial Day weekend fitting, since that holiday had taken on new meaning for our family. Instead of just another long weekend, it had become a time for remembering not just the dead, but the living veterans who'd carried their stories forward, who'd built lives worth celebrating on the foundation of sacrifice and service. My children were already making plans to attend, eager to meet the men who'd shaped their father's character in the crucible of combat. For the first time in years, our family had a shared mission, a common understanding of what mattered most. The journal entry I wrote that night was shorter than usual. "Today, I realize that legacy isn't what you accomplish, it's what you inspire others to accomplish. Tommy's legacy lives in the lives he saved and the man I became. Sarah's legacy lives in the children we raised together. My legacy will live in whatever good my children do with the values we've passed down." That's how ordinary people become extraordinary, not through single moments of heroism, but through lifetimes of faithful service to something bigger than themselves. 6 months after that first painful family dinner, I stood in my living room arranging the flag presentation case that had arrived from the Veterans Administration. The American flag inside had been flown over the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., a gesture of honor that still took my breath away. The case sat on the mantel next to Sarah's photo, my military medals, and the journal that had grown to 3 volumes. Memorial Day had become our family's annual gathering, a tradition that started with my grandchildren asking questions and evolved into a celebration of service, sacrifice, and the bonds that hold families together. Michael, Jennifer, and David had all taken time off work to spend the weekend remembering not just my service, but the larger legacy of love and commitment that defined our family. "Tell us about Tommy again, Grandpa," my grandson requested, the same question he asked every visit. The stories had become family mythology, passed down like treasured heirlooms from one generation to the next. I settled into my armchair, surrounded by children and grandchildren who looked at me with respect I'd never expected to earn in my own living room. "Tommy Chen was 18 when I met him," I began, the familiar words carrying weight and comfort. "Small guy from San Francisco who spoke 3 languages and could make you feel brave just by standing next to you." The ceremony at Fort Knox had been everything Mouse had promised and more. Standing with my surviving squad mates, now wearing suits instead of fatigues, I'd finally accepted the silver star that had taken 50 years to process. My children stood behind me as the colonel pinned the medal to my chest. tears streaming down Jennifer's face as she watched her father receive recognition that was 5 decades overdue. Danny had driven up from Kansas with his 3 sons, wheat farmers who understood the value of hard work and quiet dignity. Mouse brought his daughter, a teacher like David, who'd grown up hearing stories about her father's war buddy who'd saved his life in a jungle half a world away. "Your dad was our leader," Mouse told my children during the reception, "not because of rank, but because we trusted him to make the right call when everything went to hell. He never let us down, not once." The conversation had continued long into the night, war stories mixing with family updates, the past and present weaving together into something larger than the sum of its parts. My children had finally met the men who'd known their father as a soldier, and the picture they painted was one of courage, leadership, and absolute loyalty to the men under his command. But the real healing had happened in smaller moments. David, incorporating veteran stories into his curriculum, Jennifer's work with PTSD patients bearing fruit as she helped other families bridge the gap between civilian and military experiences, Michael's pro bono work expanding to include a non-profit organization dedicated to veterans' legal rights. "I understand now what you meant about accomplishment," Michael had said on the drive home from Kentucky. "It's not about recognition or awards. It's about how you use whatever gifts you have in service of something bigger than yourself." The journal had become a family treasure, passed around and read by children and grandchildren who wanted to understand their history. The entries about Vietnam were important, but the ones they loved most were the ordinary moments descriptions of Christmas mornings, birthday parties, quiet conversations that had shaped their parents' character. Tonight, as the family prepared to leave after our Memorial Day gathering, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from a life well lived. Not a perfect life, not a life without regrets or mistakes, but a life that had mattered in ways both large and small. My children kissed me goodbye with genuine affection, their embarrassment about their blue-collar father replaced by pride in a man they'd finally learned to see clearly. My grandchildren hugged me with the fierce love of young people who understood they came from something special, something worth preserving and passing forward. Alone in my house, I opened the journal to write the day's entry. The pages were filled now with stories of war and peace, loss and redemption. The long journey from young soldier to old man that had been marked by moments of extraordinary courage and decades of ordinary faithfulness. Today my grandson asked if I ever regretted not talking about the war sooner, I wrote. I told him that everything happens in its own time, that some truths are too heavy to carry until you're strong enough to bear their weight. I carried Tommy's memory in silence for 50 years, but now his story lives in 3 generations of our family. That's not failure, that's victory. That's how love wins in the end, how sacrifice finds its meaning, how ordinary people discover they've been extraordinary all along. I closed the journal and looked at the flag case, at the medals, at the photograph of Sarah smiling in eternal youth. Tomorrow I would start writing Volume 4, continuing the story for grandchildren not yet born, preserving the legacy of love that had sustained our family through war and peace, triumph and tragedy. The accomplishments that had seemed invisible to my children were visible now, written in their character, their choices, their commitment to serving something larger than themselves. That was the real victory, not the medals or recognition, but the knowledge that the values forged in combat and tempered in 45 years of faithful service had been passed down to another generation. In the end, that's what mattered most. Not what you accomplished, but what you inspired others to accomplish. Not the recognition you received, but the love you gave. Not the hero others saw, but the father you chose to be, day after ordinary day, for all the years that mattered.